Hello, this is the first of 3 or 4 videos on the American Revolution. I'm going to back up a little bit. We are in the file entitled Revolution, and I'm starting with slide number 23. The factors leading to the revolution, we talked about the change in ideas, the change in demographics, we talked about the distance, the uninvolvement of the English kings, and the last factor we didn't get time to touch on, but is mentioned in the book, and I think is an important one. Slides number 23 and 24, 25 are the fact that Americans had a little bit of practice with rebellions. And the largest, most important occurred exactly 100 years, if you look at that date of 1676, before the American Revolution, where we almost had an independent government in Virginia. This is Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon is not the guy you'd pick to be a revolutionary. As you can see from his portrait there, he clearly was a very wealthy aristocrat. He came to the colonies, moved to the western part of Virginia, established a very large plantation, and then something happened. And we don't know, because we don't have a diary from him, what exactly occurred. But his overseer, one of his right-hand men, was killed by Indians. We don't know the situation, but at that point he becomes a rabid total Indian hater. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. He organizes a group of vigilantes. Vigilantes are extra legal, not set up by the state, military, a private army in essence. And he goes out looking for the killers of his friend. He runs across a group of peaceful Indians, men, women, and children, about 20 of them, who had nothing to do with this event, and they are all immediately slaughtered by his guys. It erupts into an Indian war on the back country because the Indians, of course, want revenge for their relatives. A lot of killing going back and forth, a lot of destruction. And Nathaniel Bacon is called in by the governor of Virginia. What's going on out there? He tells him what's going on. There's other issues involved here. It's a little shady. He had applied for a trading license to the Indians, and the governor had turned him down. So there's clearly bad blood between the two of them. And the governor throws Nathaniel Bacon in jail. Then he makes a mistake. After a month or two, something like that, he lets Nathaniel Bacon go. He frees him from jail. Nathaniel Bacon immediately goes back out west, organizes his own independent army, basically about 1,500 guys, volunteers, and marches on Jamestown with the intent to throw the governor and the British authorities out completely. Who joins this army? Indentured servants. There are a few free Africans and a few slaves that also join. Small farmers, usually not the wealthy aristocracy, but pretty much anybody he could get to recruit, and it's well over 1,000 of them. And of course, in America, everybody has a gun. So they march on Virginia, they march on Jamestown, and they end up burning it down, which wasn't a big job because it's only about 50 wooden buildings. And the governor is terrified. The government officials flee. The governor flees to a boat offshore. And Nathaniel Bacon takes over the government of Virginia and declares it independent of the British crown. In the middle of all of this, he dies of dysentery, diarrhea, essentially, not terribly romantic, and the whole movement falls apart. The importance of this is 100 years before the Revolution, you have people in America talking about independence from the British crown, although it didn't quite work out that way because, of course, the governor came back with British troops and reestablished the regular authority. Slide number 25, I will not ask you about. It's just an interesting list. In every single colony, well before the Revolution, there are revolts against British authority, usually because the British authorities were telling them to do something they didn't want to do. Most of these are not monetary. They're not involved with taxes. They're usually who has control over what. And a lot of the British governors were there not because they loved America, but because they were there to make money out of it. And people resented that. Okay, the Other huge event that's directly related to this that also gives us some experience with rebellions, the only one before the American Revolution, is the French and Indian War. And if you look at the dates, this is only about 15 years before the Revolution. The French and Indian War was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, which tells you how long it lasted. In America, French and Indian War, because who are we fighting? The French and their Indian allies. And if you're a Native American in America, as we talked about with the French and the Spanish, you definitely sided on the side of the French because the English, you knew, were going to slaughter you and take over your lands. And the French didn't have that intention. So almost all the tribes, not all, but most tribes went over and joined with the French. The French and Indian War has been called the war that made America. This is another war we never hear about in American history, but has some significant importance. This is part of a 100-year conflict for domination, who's going to be the superpower of the world at the time, between Britain and France, and continued on and on. Before 1750, there had already been 4 wars between Britain and France for dominance with different allies. And if you look at North America very quickly, you can see on the Canada map, slide number 29, what's going to happen with this war. And this is where the English had a huge advantage from the beginning. Canada had a grand total population in 1750 of 75,000. That's it, other than Native Americans. They were all Catholic. They strictly restricted their immigration to certain people. And the American colonies, which did not restrict its immigration, had about 1.5 million people in the British colonies in America. So you have 1.5 million versus 75,000. You can tell me who's going to win that war. A quote from the British Prime Minister: "France built its best colony on a principle of exclusion and failed. England reversed that process and succeeded." So, long story short, French and Indian War in America. This is a regular war in Europe where they line up and slaughter each other. In Canada, this is a traditional war. We take the British with American allies. Remember, we are British citizens at this time. Take their huge fortress, Louisbourg, which was at the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway. There is traditional warfare in Canada. The Americans tried to invade Canada, not very successful. Moral to the story: don't try to invade a land invasion of Canada in the winter, not a good idea. There's fighting on the Great Lakes. They finally, Britain sends 9,000 troops on 150 ships down the St. Lawrence once they take that fort at the mouth of the St. Lawrence to Quebec. And almost the entire population of French Canada is in Quebec and downstream in Montreal. Quebec is isolated. It is cut off. It is 350 miles inland from the Atlantic. It cannot resupply itself. They have enough soldiers. They have 14,000 French soldiers. They have 6,000 civilians in Quebec, but they are cut off and slowly starving to death. British General Wolfe lands 7,000 soldiers off of his ships. He has some issues with that. They have supply problems. They have health problems in the camps. And what he gambles on a single attack. And if you look at the picture of Quebec, you can see the city of Quebec on a very high rise above the very wide St. Lawrence Seaway River there. But somebody, a spy, a friendly, we don't know, informed Wolfe, the British commander, of a pathway up to the top of that hill. If you go to Quebec today, it's still very hard to climb up that hill. They actually have a kind of escalator thing that you go on because it's so steep. So there was no way you could get 7,000 troops up there. Somebody told him a secret path a little bit downstream. The French wake up the next morning, they look out their window, and there are something like 4,000 British troops lined up outside Quebec. The French commander went out and head-on battle. A lot of ironies here, a lot of just plain luck. If he had waited half a day, reinforcements were coming, but he didn't. And although both commanders are killed, the French lose. They retreated, they surrendered, and Quebec falls to the British. A couple months later, again, from 3 different directions, 10,000 troops storm Montreal, and Montreal also surrenders. The British now own Canada. That's not the part of the war we're interested in. We are interested in an auxiliary war that is also happening in French territory in the Ohio Valley. And this is not so many French, but a whole lot of Indian allies. What's going on in the Ohio Valley, which was a very rich fur trading ground, particularly for beaver fur, is who's going to control that economic resource. And you have the European introduction for the first time to guerrilla warfare. Who taught guerrilla warfare to the rest of the world? Native Americans, who always fought guerrilla style. They never thought it was a great idea to line up and stand and shoot each other from a close range. So again, remember French and Indian War, with a few exceptions, the Iroquois were our allies, everybody else aligned with the French. The English were pushed back over 150 miles past the peak of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The key factor is guerrilla warfare. What is guerrilla warfare? How do we define it? A guerrilla warfare means in Spanish little war. Basically, it is not so much an undeclared war as not a traditional war. The one rule about guerrilla warfare is there are no rules. There are no standard battles as we know it. There often are no regular soldiers. People come and go. They have no training. They have no uniform. Very often they have no pay or salary. It is hit and run. It is ambush. It is raiding. You can use torture. You can kill POWs. You can involve, almost always, guerrilla warfare involves civilians and often high casualty rates with civilians. The one rule is there are no rules. And we learned it from Native Americans. Perfect example of this is what happens at Fort Duquesne in the middle of the Ohio Valley, where 2 great rivers come together to form the Ohio River in a triangle. Pittsburgh today is the city there, and the stadium in Pittsburgh, which I think was torn down a couple years ago, was called 3 Rivers Stadium. If you control that point, you control all of the fur trade in the Ohio Valley because everything moves by water. So this is held by the French. Actually, a very young, very tall Virginian took 600 Virginia militia volunteers, frontiersmen, to try and capture this French fort and failed completely. This is the first time we see that very young, tall Virginian named George Washington. So he returns. It is a failure. They have not captured the fort. It's still in French hands. So the English decide, okay, we will send a British general with 6,000 men. The army marches, and they are marching overland from West Virginia to that point in the Ohio Valley where the 3 rivers meet. They are also joined by hundreds of, again, American volunteers because we are fighting with the British. We are British citizens, and their commander is the same young, tall Virginian, George Washington, who is only 22 years old at the time. He was voted commander by his troops. We'll talk about that later. But it's the British Army marching. So when they go into the dense woods, the thick wilderness with no roads, certainly nothing that you could move wagons on, they have to literally chop a path through the wilderness. They have a wagon train of supplies of 6 miles, plus close to 3,000 horses, plus their hay wagons. They have artillery that's being drawn by horses. You have to clear a road where it didn't exist. British officers, of course, like to travel in style. I'm not making this up. The leader of the British forces was a general named Braddock, who liked to live very well. He brought along his own German band to play music while he ate dinner. He brought trunks and trunks of different outfits. He brought his multiple mistresses and their stuff. They were camp followers, women washermen, women prostitutes that followed any army at the time. They are not making good time, and this is certainly not a surprise attack. They make 22 miles in 7 days. They are going very slowly because they have to chop a road through the woods. What happens? Middle of the dense woods, before they get to the French fort, a grand total of 100 French soldiers, because there weren't many there, 146 Canadian volunteers, and a little bit over 600 Indians. In other words, basically about a fourth of the number of British troops. But they have a guerrilla-style attack, and they descend upon the British army that is strung out in a line in the woods. In 10 minutes, it is total chaos. All the Indians had to do was yell a war whoop, and the British, who were terrified of Indians and heard all the stories about slaughtering and scalping and all that stuff, dropped their guns literally and ran like rabbits. They ran backwards, retreating. They ran into the wagons and the other troops. Within something like 2 hours, 900 British casualties versus a grand total of 50 French and 30 Indians. So it is a slaughter and a huge defeat for the British Army. Years later, the British Army send wagons back to pick up the bones of their soldiers, and the officer in charge wrote, the bones were so thick, one lay on top of another for over half a mile. The whole battle lasts 3 hours, and the British are totally defeated in a guerrilla attack. The only person who comes out of this with any glory and success whatsoever are the Virginians, who were experienced in frontier warfare. They knew exactly what to do. They didn't line up in the dense dark green woods in bright red coats because they were in buckskin and leather clothing anyway. They immediately took cover behind trees and whatever and fought back guerrilla style to the Indians and French attacking. They have very few losses. They didn't lose too many Virginians. George Washington, who is the commander of the Virginians, places his men in shelter and goes back to help organize the British retreat so they're not slaughtered any more than they were already. This is pretty amazing stuff. We have eyewitnesses to this. Again, I'm not making this up. I don't do fake news. In this 3-hour battle, George Washington had 2 horses shot from underneath him. Somebody gives him a third, and he keeps riding back and forth trying to organize the British troops. At the end of the battle, when they retreat, he has 8 bullet holes through his clothes and 1 through his hat. And he comes out of that battle riding back and forth in full view of the Indians and French without a scratch. When he gets through, literally, his troops think he is bulletproof. This is our first picture of George Washington. When he gets back to Virginia, who are you going to put in charge of the Virginia militia permanently? Get that guy. He's tall, he has experience, and he's bulletproof. And that is a true story. The end of the war, the Peace of Paris, slide number 30. You can see in the next slide what happens to Canada. This is 9 years in America. It goes on well after it's settled in Europe. And Britain became a British empire. I'm quoting, half a continent changed hands at the scratch of a pen. What has happened before and after, pictures there on the maps, France has disappeared in North America. She left her colony largely undefended, and she lost it. Everything west of the Mississippi that had belonged to France and east of the Mississippi, anything east went to Britain, everything west went to Spain. France lost everything. There are also islands like Cuba that changed hands in the Caribbean. French got some fishing rights in the North Atlantic, so did the Americans. That's a minor issue, but had huge effects for America. Number one, this is our first contact in the Ohio Valley, and people see, oh my gosh, this is a very rich agricultural area, and settlers begin moving in. While the war is going on, while he's serving in the military, George Washington buys 20,000 acres of land west of the mountains. He had a good eye for land. When the American Revolution comes along, very few years later, this is the only military experience Americans have had, especially George Washington, who becomes our commander in chief, and another guy we'll talk about, Francis Marion, too. So our officers had all fought in the French and Indian War. It's the only military experience we had. We weren't going to Europe and fighting their wars. It particularly is valuable for George Washington because he sees the weaknesses and strengths of the British Army and knows what to do. It is the first time that the colonies really even worked with each other because they were so widely separated. And Ben Franklin shows up again with his Albany Plan in 1754. He has a plan for uniting the colonies. He had planned the whole thing out. He's very brilliant. He had figured out how to organize the military. He had invented a flag, that wonderful little flag with the snake chopped in pieces, which says join or die. Either join together or you will be chopped to pieces, literally, by the Native Americans. He has a way to pay for it with an alcohol tax. And he gets no support. It's a plan that's never executed. Remember, this is not asking for independence. This is asking for the colonies to unite better than they have because they were totally ununited. First of all, the British king is not in favor of this idea for obvious reasons. We don't want those colonies united, better off separate. Number two, the colonies themselves don't want anybody telling them what to do. They want to remain totally separate. They did not see themselves connected. Virginians saw themselves as Virginians. Massachusetts men saw themselves as Massachusetts men. They didn't see any connection. So Ben Franklin is way ahead of his time here, but it's used as a template later on in the Revolution. The last thing that comes out of the French and Indian War is the proclamation line of 1763 at the end of the war, which was done, by the way, July 4th. What this does is basically create a boundary. It's a no-go zone. It tells colonists you cannot go west of the mountains. This is Britain's line. There's no wall there. It's an imaginary line at the crest of the mountains. And the orders were, American colonists from Britain, you do not move west of this line. This is logical from the British point of view. They don't want settlers in the Ohio Valley. They're going to cause trouble with the Indians. We're going to have to send troops. We're going to have to supply forts. We're going to have to build roads. No, you stay to the east, leave the Indians to the west. Unfortunately, there are already 50 to 75,000 settlers in the Ohio Valley. It was kind of moot when they made the line. What are you going to do to keep Americans east of the mountains once they've seen land west of the mountains? Not very successful. Britain did keep about 10,000 troops in Canada and in the Ohio Valley in small forts, but Americans had already started moving in. The other interesting sidelight that has a lot to do with Texas and particularly Louisiana is what happened to the French Canadians after the war. They had fought against the British. Technically, they were traitors. Some of the adult males, if they had indicated they had fought or they were captured, were rounded up and sold as slave labor to British plantations, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, with a very high death rate, of course. Some of the civilians stayed in Canada as British subjects. They were not happy about it, but they stayed. A good number were not happy at all. And what they did, and the British helped them do this to some extent, is they got on ships, they sailed up the St. Lawrence, they sailed down the Atlantic, they sailed up the Gulf of Mexico, and they landed at the other end of French territory, which was no longer French. The other end of French territory, the other end of the Mississippi River, of course, is New Orleans. They landed in Louisiana, named after King Louis of France, and being persecuted because they had fought against the British, they moved into the swamps as quickly as they could and are still there, and still French-speaking, many of them. This is where the French Cajuns come. In Louisiana. They have been there since 1760 or so, their ancestors. Cajun comes from the French word for Canada, which was Acadia. These were Acadians or Cajuns. So, a lot of interesting side effects of the French and Indian War. But there is a direct line between the French and the Indian War and the American Revolution. First of all, it's less than 15 years before. Second of all, wars are always expensive. Britain had sent over 10,000 troops to North America and kept forts and troops in Canada and in the Ohio Valley. How are you going to pay for these? That's the problem. And the first thing Britain has to do is raise taxes, and for the first time, begin to tax Americans. And that is the direct line between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. And we will talk about the change in British rules and taxes in the next video. Stay safe.